Hi class. In this video, we'll be covering variables in JavaScript. Variables are an important topic, so we often cover it at the beginning of the semester. With programming, everything sort of fits together, so sometimes it's difficult to figure out where to start. But variables are a good place to start, and they're going to lead us towards creating an interactive self-portrait. So for this week, we're just going to focus on adding variables to our project. So we're not going to be making anything interactive quite yet, but once we get through this portion, we'll be able to add interactivity using variables in the third version of our self-portrait project. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to open up my project and talk a little bit about what we've made so far, and then talk about how variables are going to fit into that. So I'm going to start by opening up the GitHub desktop app. And I always want to make sure to fetch the origin just to see if there's any new changes. And it looks like there's nothing new so far. And since I'm starting a new project today, I'm going to duplicate my folder from last time. So this is something we'll do a lot so that we can keep copies of earlier versions of our projects. So I'm going to click Show in Finder, and that'll open up MMP 210. And here's a self-portrait version 1 that I created last time. And I'm just going to duplicate that folder. So on Mac, I can hit Command D and then hit Enter to rename the folder version 2. Okay, I can also right-click and choose Duplicate. If you're on a PC, you probably want to do Control-C, Control-V to copy and paste. So there's a few different ways that you can copy that project. Whatever's easiest, go ahead and make a copy and rename this version 2. And I'm going to add in some code here, and we're also going to add in some new variables and other content. Okay, so I'm going to now open it up in Sublime Text. So if I want to open it in Sublime, I can go to Repository and click an Open in Sublime Text. I'll open that up, and here's my self-portrait version 2, and here's the sketch.js. So I'm going to increase the font size a bit here. And remember last time I deleted my self-portrait so that you guys would have sort of a place to start from scratch. So I'm going to bring that back. And so I went over this in the previous video, but I'm just going to go quickly. Going to go to the history in GitHub and find the self-portrait that I made. I'm just going to copy this code. This isn't always how you use GitHub, but this is just going to be a little bit faster. So I'm going to copy this in here. And so here's my self-portrait. And I'm going to change this comment to self-portrait version 2. So we're going to start here and add some variables. I'm going to talk first a little bit about what variables are. Let's get this running in the Sublime server first. So I'm going to go to Tools, Sublime Server, and start Sublime Server. And then I'm going to go to a new Chrome window and go to the local host 8080 and click on MMP 210. And so now I'm working on project 2. So we can update the project 2 link. So I'll go back and open index.html for the main page and just go down here, and I'll update this to self-portrait v2. And I'll change the name here, self-portrait version 2. So now I have that link here, and I'll click on that. And we see the self-portrait. I guess I didn't copy over the background. That's okay. We can add the background in. I'm just going to open up the console so we can see if we have any errors or anything like that as we're working. So there's my self-portrait. And one of the main things that you'll notice about this self-portrait is that it's static. I can't really move it around or change the position or do anything like that. And that's because we haven't used any variables, so we can't change the values that determine where it's drawn. So I'm going to bring in the background again. I'm going to close out this index page. I'll go to my draw function and just do the background. I'll do kind of a neutral light gray background. And so the values that we're using are all just hard-coded numbers. And when I say hard-coded, what I mean is anytime you see a number, like the background 220 is hard-coded, this triangle 380, 50, all of these numbers are hard-coded. That's the word to refer to anything in our code that's just like a piece of data, like a number. These numbers determine how our self-portrait appears on the canvas. So for example, this fill is the amount of red, green, and blue that make up the purple background of my character's face. And then the X value of the triangle is that 380 pixels. So that's 380 pixels from here to here. And then the next value is 50 pixels on Y. So that's 50 pixels down here. Followed by 600. That's the value on X that goes all the way down to here. And Y is 60. So that's another hard-coded value. Finally, we have the 500X down here. So that's the X position that brings us all the way over here. And then 360 for the Y is the value that makes the triangle go down to here. And so we have all these numbers, and those numbers are never going to change. As long as we're drawing our self-portrait with those numbers, that self-portrait is always going to appear exactly in this position, with exactly these colors and exactly these proportions. And so one of the ways that we can make our self-portrait interactive is by adding variables. So adding the ability to change what numbers are being used. So in order to do that, let's go over a couple things about JavaScript, and then we'll add some variables to the scene. So to start, let's just talk about the different types of text that we see in a JavaScript program, because we're still beginners here, and so there's a lot of stuff that we're still getting used to. And so there's basically a few different types of text that appear in a JavaScript program, or really in any program. Some of those pieces of text are predetermined. They're decided by the language. And other of those pieces of text are things that we decide, like the numbers and names of variables and things like that. So one type of text in a JavaScript document is a keyword. So keywords are any words that are reserved by the language. So things like function are keywords. We actually don't really have any other keywords in this program so far, but we're going to add some more today. So a keyword is a word like function, and the word that we'll be introducing today, which is VAR, which is short for variable. These are words that are predefined by the programming language that always have the same meaning, so they always do the same thing. The next type of text that we use in a JavaScript file are variable names or function names. So variable and function names. And those are things that we usually make up. P5 has made up a bunch of them for us. So setup is an example, draw is an example. All of these functions are names that P5 has actually created, but we'll also create in the future. So we'll be making our own versions of those names. And we're going to be replacing some of our hard data with variable names. So that's another type is just data, or hard data, or as we talked about, hard-coded values. So that's numbers. Okay, so we have a lot of numbers, 640, 360, 500, 360. Any numbers that you see in the program, that's just data. Those are values that don't change. We also have colors and other values that are really what we call strings. Okay, and we'll go over strings in more depth in the future. So strings are another piece of hard data, and there's a few other types that we will cover as we go through the semester. Besides those three main categories, we also have our semicolons and parentheses and curly brackets, all these little characters that are basically the punctuation of our program. So those are called operators. And we can think of those as sort of, delimiters or punctuation that separate our code. So all the commas and special characters are operators. And then, of course, we have our comments like up here and down here, which are not actually interpreted by the program. So they are part of our file, but they're not actually read by the program. So those are the different types of text that you'll see in any JavaScript document. Anything else, probably doesn't belong there, or will probably throw an error. But as long as you have those types of text, then you have a valid JavaScript document. What we're going to be focusing on today is variables. So we're going to be taking these numbers that we have and replacing them with variables, and we're going to be coming up with our own names for those variables. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, and so we'll go into the best ways to do that. So I'm going to start just by writing a simple variable. And then I'm going to explain a little bit about how it works. So when I write a variable, I'm going to put this variable by itself at the top of my program. And we'll get a little bit more into why I'm doing this when we talk about functions a little bit later in the semester. But for now, what I'll mention is that this is called the global scope. Okay, so the global scope is anything that's not inside of a function. So in between these two brackets or in between these two brackets for our draw function, any code in here is inside of a function. Any code that's not inside of a function, and usually we put it at the top of the program, but it actually doesn't matter. I could put it here or down here and it would act the same way. But we usually call that the global scope. And so these variables are accessible to all of the functions in the program. So when I'm creating a variable, I use the var keyword, and that's just kind of telling my JavaScript program that I want to create a variable, and then I give it a name. So for this exercise, I'm going to start with the variable x, and this is something that you'll see a lot. So variable x, and then I'm going to set it equal to a value, and I'm just going to choose one of our x values. So I'm going to choose something. Maybe I'll choose the left eye here. So put a little space over here. And I'm just going to copy that number and say x equals 430. And I'll use this as kind of the starting point for this eyeball here. And I may make some updates to this in a second. So I'm just going to say variable x equals 430. And when I write a statement like this is actually the first, our function calls are technically statements, but this is usually what a statement in JavaScript looks like. I'll call this a statement. And a statement is basically when we start with a declaration or a variable. So when we use var, we're declaring the variable. So we're saying we want this variable to exist. And then the equal sign is setting this number value into that variable. And so variables are a bit tricky to understand at first. But basically what we're doing, one way of thinking about a variable is we're kind of creating on our computer. Let's imagine that we have a computer and it's got a hard drive, or in some cases it's got RAM memory or something like that. And anyway, it has memory, right? So it has memory where it stores data. So let's say this is like its memory here. And when we create a variable, we're basically taking out like a little area of that memory. There's millions or billions of them. And we're basically just saying we want to take this one little area of memory and we want to give it a label. So we can think of it kind of like a bucket. Like if we have a bucket right here, it's not a very good bucket drawing, but that's okay. We're going to give this bucket a label. So we're going to call it X. And then we're going to put this number 430 inside of the bucket. And so that way, instead of having to remember 430, we can just remember the label X. And so 430 is a value, but it doesn't really tell us what it's being used for. X tells us that it's some value that's on the x-axis. And so that way we can replace any piece of data that uses this 430 with our x value. So let's try that. So I'm going to put x here for that circle. And then when I reload my page, you'll see that nothing changes. The I is still exactly where it was before. However, if I change this value, so let's change it to like 0. So now our value is in a different position. And this is jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the cool things about a variable is we can actually update the value. So if we wanted to create some sort of animation, I could say something like, I could change x, so I could say x plus equals 5 or something like that. And I'll cover what that means in a later video. And so now we've got like an animation. Okay, I could also say that x is equal to the mouse. So I could say x equals mouse x, which is another variable I'll cover later in the semester. And so now you can see my self-portrait is interactive. So with a number value for the X of that circle, it's never gonna move, just like this right eyeball never moves. But if I use a variable, I can change the value that goes in the X bucket. And so I can move that eye back and forth. And so that's just like one really simple example of interactivity. But as we build out our sketch with more examples, we can eventually, move the whole sketch around or move different components of it. So I'm going to go through a few more examples of using variables in our program. And then eventually what you will be doing for your homework is just making sure that all of the values that you use, all of these numbers, can be replaced with variables. So I'm not going to do every single one, but I'll go through a few just to give you guys a sense of how it works. And we can also talk a little bit about some of the naming conventions. So for this first variable, since I only had one, I called it X because it was just kind of easy to do. But it doesn't actually really tell me what the X value for this is for. What I want to do when I'm naming a variable is give it a very specific name so I know what it's being used for. And so what a more specific name for this X value would actually be to say that it's the eyeball, and it's actually the right eyeball. So I can say or I could say right eye, or sorry, it's actually the left eyeball. So this is the left eye X value. And so let's set that back to what it was, 430. And then I'll remove this line, and then I'll put left eye X here. So that tells me exactly what that value is for. So if I wanted to change it, like if I wanted to move the eye, a bit closer into the face, I could increment it there and then update that value. So another advantage of having these variables is I know exactly what this is being used for. I don't have to look through my program and kind of like guess what all these numbers are about. So we have the left eye X. And so let's add in another variable for the right eye X. So down here, it's 550. I can type in right eye X and then make a new variable right eye X, and I can say that that's 550, and so they'll stay in the same place. Oops, misspelled this. Okay, so now they're in the same place as they were before. However, one thing that I might want to do to make the program work a little bit better is to make these values relative to some other value. So I might choose, a center point for the X value of my character, and then base the other values of the character on that X point. The reason I would do this is to kind of make my calculations a little bit easier, and I can also use math to do that, to set it up. So with this character, since I'm using a triangle for the background, it's a little bit trickier to set that up exactly. But let's make like let's make a point in the middle of the character that we can just use as sort of our origin, and then we'll start from there. So I'm gonna create like a variable X, and I'll say that that's probably somewhere in the middle here is maybe like 500. And then I'll create a variable Y that is, somewhere in the middle here. So maybe that's like 200. So then I can do some simple math to figure out where things are based on that, and then I can choose to make interactions with those variables. So one thing I can do to visualize this sort of origin point, I'm going to put a little comment here that says character origin, is I can just draw like a little circle where I think that should be. And I'll draw it on top of everything else. I can always take this out later. So this is really just kind of like visually for me to see. So I'll just do a circle at X, Y, and I'll just make it like 10 pixels wide so I can see where that center is. And that's pretty good as far as the center. I guess I could move it up to where the eyes are. That might make more sense. So the eyes are both at 150. So I'll use that for the Y instead. So that'll be easy to do some calculations. The y value will be the same for the i's. And I'm just going to make that a different color so that I remember that I don't want it in there. So I'm going to make it like light green. I guess there's no fill there, so I'll try stroke. Okay, so that way I'll remember that this is just kind of my origin point. I can make it even smaller so it's not overlapping with stuff. And so eventually I'll just remember that that's the XY value here, this little green dot. And then I can remove that later. So maybe I'll put a little comment here that just says visualize origin. And so ultimately what I want to be able to do is move the entire character as one piece so it moves around the screen. And that's one way of making it interactive. There's a lot of other stuff I could do, like I could make the eyes bigger or smaller, and I'll kind of demonstrate some different things with that next week when I go over interactivity. But for now, our goal is to write all of the X and Y variables so that we can move our character around the screen. And then we'll do some size variables as well. So now instead of the left eye X and the right eye X, I can just use these values relative to our character origin. So for the left eye X, if that's 430, that's 70 less than the X value. So I would just say X minus 70. And for right eye X, that's 550. So that's 50 more than the X value. So I would say X plus 50. And so with JavaScript, with variables, I can use operators like plus, minus, multiply, and divide. Most of what we're going to do is just plus and minus for the X and Y because we want everything to be relative to the X. So when we're creating something that's interactive, we have this origin point X, Y here. And if you have like a character in a video game or in a scene or something like that, if the character has the X, Y in the middle, when you move the X, Y, the character should move, each part of the character should move along with the X, Y. And in order for that to work, the origin of all of these points has to be based on that X, Y position. So to get the head X, Y, I have to go up from the origin X, Y. To get the legs, I have to go down. And so everything has to be based around this kind of center point in order for this to work correctly. I don't really need these variables anymore, although it was good to go over the best way to write those. So let's keep going with the X's. So just keep in mind that our original X is 500. So we can do the values for our triangle. So remember the triangle is X, Y, X, Y, X, Y. And so we can just go 1, 2, X1, X2, X3. So 500 is the same, so that's easy, just X. 600 is X plus 100, and 380, the difference would be, let me just try that real quick. You can always just, 120. So you can always just do the math in a calculator if you want. So negative 120. So our triangle is the same now, but if we move X, okay, so now the head and the eyes move, but the hair and the mouth stay in the same place. And that's actually kind of fun in a certain way. Like, you could play with that as one of your ways of using interactivity is moving some parts of the face and not the others. And if I change X over here in the console, which is another thing the console is useful for, like if I say X is 300, then it'll move over. So that's another thing that I can use the console for is if I have these global variables, I can actually update them over here. So let's put that back to 500. And so now we just have the mouth and the hair. So let's keep going. So this was the eyes. Now we have the mouth. So 450 for the X value of the mouth is just 50 less than X. So X minus 50. And so let's see, we can test that if we go X equals 200. Okay, now we've got the mouth. And then the hair is tricky because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 different X values. So normally when you're writing code, you would have already written your variables to start, so you wouldn't be replacing the variables like this. This is just an exercise we're doing since we're kind of learning this from scratch. But we can do this pretty quickly. 500 is a nice round number, so let's see. 400 is x minus 100, and then we just go from there. So x minus 80, x minus 60, x minus 40. So each one is 20 more than the one before, x minus 20. Then 500 is just x, and 520 is x plus 20. So that should do half of the x values for our hair. I'm actually going to make the background darker because, yeah, we have lighter colors. So let's see what happens if I change x to 200. Okay, now we're stretching the hair. So we did get some of the hair values, but we missed the other hair values. And that's another thing that might be fun to play with when we make it interactive. So let's go with the other ones. So for 30, so these are basically just 10 different from each of these. So for 30, so x minus 70, x minus 50, and then it just kind of keeps going from there. X minus 30, x minus 10, and then this is bigger than x, so we do x plus 10, and oh, these got off because this is just x, so now we go back here, x plus 30, and then x plus 50. Okay, so now if I say x equals 0, so now we've got everything. X equals 200, x equals 500. So now everything moves in our design. So that's just on the x-axis. Let's try the y-axis now. So for example, if I change the y value here, if I say y equals 0, nothing happens. Our origin dot moves, but our character doesn't move. So let's update with the y as well. And so we can start with a triangle. So the y values are 50, 60, and 360. So this is a little bit harder based on 150, but let's try it. So 50 is 100 less, so we say y minus 100. And 60 is just 10 more, so that's y minus 90. That one's a little tricky. And then 360 is like 210 bigger, so that's y plus 210. So we're just figuring out the difference between them. So now the triangle should move if I say y equals 0. Okay, the triangle moves. We got to fix the rest of the face. The eyes are really easy because they're right at y, so I'll just put y there and put y there. And so now if I change y to like 200, okay, everything moves down. We just have the hair and the mouth left. So we have the mouth here, the y value. So the y value is the second value after x. So y is 150. This is 250. So that's just y plus 100. Okay, so if we say y equals 200, now we just have to do the hair. The hair is the longest one, but for these, the y values are the same, so that's nice. On the first point, they're all 40, and the second part, they're all 80. So 40 is y minus 110. So I'll just put y minus 110, and then I can just copy that for all the y values. And then 80 is 40. Let's see, 50 plus 20 is 70, so 80 is just y minus 70. So getting those lines is a little tricky because you have to do more of the points, but you can get them eventually. And now we can move, so if I say x is 200 and if I say y equals 300, okay, or let's back it up a bit. So now our whole character moves when I move those x and y variables. So if I change x and y, for example, if I say x equals mouse x, y equals mouse y, and again, I'll cover that more in depth next week. Now I can actually move my character around the screen. So that's pretty cool. One more thing I'll go over is the size values, because we can change the size of the character. However, the size values really only works with like our circle and our ellipse and our rectangle for our mouth. It doesn't really work with our lines or our triangle without doing a lot of more complicated math, because the triangle is based on just some points. So if we want to make it bigger, we have to move all those points away from the origin point, and that is going to get a little bit too tricky for this video. But just to add a few more variables, we can change the size of the eyes a bit. So I'm going to make a new variable and say eye size, and I'll set it to the size of the larger one. So let's see, one is just 100 width and height, and the other one is 100 width. So we say eye size equals 100. Again, using the camel case here. So the first letter is lowercase, the second word, So the first letter is camel case, the second word is capitalized. So for the eye size is 100. I can fill in that for the left eye size, and for the right eye. And then here, since the height of the right eye is just half of that, instead of making a new variable, I'll just say eye size divided by 2. So I can also use division here. It's good to use spaces in between your operators for mathematical operators. So I'll say eye size and then eye size divided by 2. So now the eyes stay the same, but then I could also make that interactive. So if I say eye size equals 20, now both the eyes are going to get smaller. And then we can do the mouth as well. So the mouth also has 100 as the eye size. If I put eye size in there, it's going to be a little confusing because it is the mouth. So I'm just going to put mouth size, whoops, that one's hard to spell, equals eye size. So I'll just set it to the same thing. That's another thing I can do, is set one variable to another variable as long as this variable already has a value. So now for the rectangle, I'll say mouth size. And then 20, this one is a little bit trickier, but 20 is just 1/5 of 100. So I'll say mouth size divided by 5. And then 10 is 1/10. So I'll say mouth size divided by 10. So now if I want to change the mouth size, I can say it equals 20, and everything updates, the same. So I can add some new interactions by using these different variables. Another thing that's nice about variables is it makes our code a lot easier to understand. So we know we have an X and Y for the character's origin, we have a size for the eye, we have a size for the mouth, and then we can start to go through and say, okay, this is the face, the triangle is X, Y, X, Y, X, Y, X, Y. So we kind of understand better what these different pieces of data are. This circle for the left eye is the X position, the Y position, and the eye size. So instead of just random hard-coded numbers that we have to figure out how to change, we have some very simple numbers up here, which we can then update in our code. So I'm going to get rid of this origin visualization. So I'll just comment it out so you guys can see it later in your code, or in the example code. So I'll get rid of the origin, and then there are some variables, like I could use some of the different colors here. So for example, this purple fill, like if I made this a variable, so I could say something like variable face red equals 162, and then I could fill that in here. Then I could actually make the face interactive, like or the color interactive. If I set that to 0, it's going to change. If I set it to 255, it's going to change. And so I can kind of like change the face color as well. So anything that's like a number or a piece of data, you can save as a variable. For the face, let's see, these is just a string. I'm going to go over strings more in a couple weeks, so we'll leave these for now. But we could do all of the color variables here. So face red, face blue is 108, and face green is 227. So that way we have all the numbers are now variables. Oh, did I put these backwards? Oh yeah, I did. Red, green, blue. But now I can say if I want the green to be less, I can say face green equals 0, and then I get a different color. So I can make the colors interactive as well as the shapes and sizes, as long as I'm using numbers. I can't really change like this string in an interactive way. I could change it to some other string, but I can't like take a little bit of the yellow out of these values. So we'll look at more of how to do stuff like that in later videos. But now it looks like in every single one of my little argument areas, I have variables and not just numbers. So that looks pretty good. So yeah, that's basically what we're working on this week. So your design is going to look the same as last week, but just with variables instead of hard-coded numbers. It's a little boring, but it is going to set us up to do a lot more interesting stuff next week. Now that I'm done with this part of the project, I'm just going to go to GitHub and go back to my changes and make sure that looks good and say updated or adds self-portrait version 2 with variables, and click commit to master and push to origin. And if I view on GitHub, now we can see for self-portrait version 2 on GitHub. Oh, I still have the self-portrait version 1 thumbnail. So I didn't actually change anything, although I did change the background color. So let's save that. Or just save it as v2.png. And so just so I am consistent with that, I can delete this one, and then it'll go into my downloads folder when I save it. So I'm going to create a new folder, go to downloads, and drag that in there. So now for that thumbnail, I can just go ahead, that's on my index page, so I'll go to index.html, and for the thumbnail, I'll just replace this with self-portrait version 2 / v2.png. And let's go home and take a look at that. Okay, that looks good. And so it might look the same for you, or if you want to make some changes, go ahead and do that, but that's okay. So now I'm just going to update that again. So I'm going to say updated thumbnail and commit to master and push to origin. And there we go. That's pretty much it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions or need help when you're going over this. In the next video for this week, I'm going to talk about debugging a little bit. Since we are starting to write some more code, you are going to start to see some errors. And I have a little debugging challenge for you guys to work on in class as well.